Most people strive to be good, kind, selfless, morally upright. Society praises those who adhere to these ideals, and we often measure our worth by how well we fit into this mold of goodness. But what if that very pursuit of perfection is actually destroying your authenticity? According to Jung, the mask of virtue that we wear often hides the most repressed aspects of our personality. In the quest to be seen as good, we disconnect from who we truly are, suppressing our true feelings, desires, and instincts. This mask, polished and perfected, may make us look appealing on the surface, but it leads to inner turmoil, quiet resentment, and a life that feels hollow. This video explores the hidden dangers of clinging to the idea of being good, how it creates a false self that pushes us further away from our true power, truth, and potential. We'll examine the cost of moral perfectionism, how it feeds the shadow within, and why the pursuit of external approval can suffocate your authenticity. Get ready to challenge everything you think you know about morality, virtue, and your own identity. It's time to uncover the truth behind the mask and explore how striving to be good can be a trap that robs you of your real self. From an early age, everyone learns to wear a mask. The child who notices their parents praise them for being good starts smiling more, talking less, hiding anger. That's how the persona begins, what Jung described as the social mask we wear to be accepted. The problem? Most people start confusing this mask with who they really are. And that's when the quiet collapse begins. The persona might seem harmless. After all, no one wants to be rejected. But when you start believing the role you play is your true self, you lose touch with your inner reality. The nice guy, the sweet girl, the understanding friend, all sanitized versions of the self, shaped to avoid rejection. But behind that polished virtue, something darker starts to grow. Jung warned, the more you identify with your mask, the more you empower the shadow, that hidden vault where everything repressed goes to live. And don't think it disappears. It doesn't. It grows in silence, craving recognition. That outburst in traffic, that smile masking the urge to scream, that's shadow work in disguise. Emotional repression always finds a way out. At some point, this effort to appear morally upright turns into subtle self-righteousness. The person starts to believe they're better than others, more evolved, more spiritual, when in truth, they're just avoiding their own unconscious mind. And here's the trap. The more perfectly you try to behave, the less room you leave for your full humanity, messy, emotional, intense, and deeply authentic. Picture someone who always says yes. They help everyone, stay kind to strangers, never complain. On Instagram, a cascade of virtue signaling. But in the mirror, empty eyes, drained soul, lost sense of self. The mask gets applause, but it takes a toll. Over time, a strange hollowness creeps in. A disconnection from their own thoughts, feelings, desires. That's when shadow work becomes not just helpful, but necessary. Here's the part no one tells you. The good citizen mask is socially rewarded, but spiritually corrosive. When you disconnect from your truth just to maintain a polished image, something inside starts to rot. And that leads to a question most avoid. What have you been sacrificing just to look like a good person? Being too good is rarely about virtue. More often, it's about fear, and fear demands sacrifice. Every time you suppress your anger to keep the peace, smile when you want to scream, or agree just to avoid conflict, you're not choosing kindness. You're abandoning authenticity. Jung warned that this type of repression doesn't dissolve the emotion. It buries it in the unconscious, where it festers and grows. And eventually, it breaks through the surface. You don't get rid of an emotion by ignoring it. You just give it more power behind the scenes. A person who never expresses their darker impulses becomes a ticking time bomb. Not because they're bad, but because they're human. We all feel rage, jealousy, pride. Repressing those feelings in the name of moral perfection doesn't make you pure. It makes you dishonest with yourself. And dishonesty is a form of spiritual decay. Over time, this fake goodness creates tension, a split between your inner world and the image you project. You start to live in two realities, the one everyone praises and the one you privately suffer in. You might appear calm, kind, generous, but inside, You're exhausted. You carry unspoken frustration, unmet needs, hidden resentment. That's the emotional tax of repression. You get the approval, but you lose the self. This inner conflict often leaks out in subtle ways: passive aggression, sarcasm, anxiety, even physical illness. The body keeps score when the soul is silenced. You find yourself lashing out over small things or secretly judging others who do express their emotions. Why? Because deep down, you envy their freedom. You've imprisoned yourself in the name of being good, and now you resent those who live unapologetically. Jung believed that repression was one of the main sources of neurosis. And yet, society encourages it. We reward politeness over honesty, agreeableness over authenticity. But the cost is immense. You begin to lose your intuition, that primal compass that tells you what you really want, what you really feel. Without that, you become numb, a shell of moral behavior, disconnected from the vitality that once made you human. So here's the hard truth. The pursuit of moral perfection often becomes a form of self-erasure. You start censoring yourself so much that eventually, there's nothing left to say. You mistake silence for virtue, compliance for maturity. But inside, your unlived emotions scream to be heard. Jung's work teaches us that real wholeness doesn't come from being flawless. It comes from embracing the mess, the contradiction, the wildness of your true self. Many people act good, not out of virtue, but out of fear. Jung saw this clearly. When someone is obsessively agreeable, overly polite, or never disagrees, it's often a defense mechanism. A way to avoid conflict. A way to survive. They fear rejection, judgment, or being seen as difficult. So instead of showing up authentically, they shrink themselves into a mask of harmlessness. This kind of goodness is not strength, it's submission. It's a strategy used by people who were taught that love is conditional. That if they say the wrong thing or displease others, they'll be abandoned. So they become masters of adaptation, pleasers, chameleons. They convince themselves that being easygoing is a virtue, but deep down it's fear in disguise, fear of not being accepted as they are. Jung believed that the path to individuation, becoming your true self, requires courage. But cowardice loves comfort. It avoids confrontation, even when confrontation is necessary for growth. It avoids truth, even when truth is screaming to be spoken. And over time, this fear-driven niceness becomes a cage. You begin to lose your voice, your preferences, your identity, all in the name of being liked. There's a hidden tragedy here, because when your main goal is to be accepted, you stop asking what you want. You become passive in your own life. You wait for others to decide what's right, what's safe, what's okay to say. And the longer you live like this, the more your soul withers. Jung said that people who repress themselves to fit in often end up with no center, no core, just a mask polished to please. What's worse is that this goodness is often praised by society. Teachers love obedient students. Bosses love employees who don't challenge authority. Families love children who never rebel. But all this praise reinforces a dangerous idea, that being good means being silent, submissive, and agreeable, and that standing up for yourself is somehow selfish or wrong. This is how goodness becomes weakness. To reclaim your strength, you must risk rejection. You must dare to say no, to disagree, to speak when your voice shakes. Jung taught that only by confronting fear can you integrate it. Only by facing the tension can you become whole. True goodness isn't about avoiding conflict. It's about embodying integrity, even when it's uncomfortable. Especially when it's uncomfortable. That's not cowardice, that's courage. Every time you silence a part of yourself to appear good, you feed your shadow. The shadow in Jungian terms is everything you reject, deny, or suppress, your anger, lust, jealousy, ambition. But suppression doesn't erase these forces. It exiles them to the unconscious. And what lives in the unconscious doesn't die. It acts without your awareness. It sabotages relationships. It creates patterns you can't explain. It shows up as chaos. You think you're being kind by hiding your resentment, but it leaks out in passive-aggressive comments. You think you're being selfless by burying your ambition, but it resurfaces as envy when others succeed. The more you ignore the shadow, the more power it gains. It becomes like a pressure cooker, sealed tight on the outside, but boiling with emotional intensity within. Jung warned that the unexamined shadow will always find a way out, and it usually chooses the most destructive path. The tragedy is that most people don't even realize what's happening. They think they're unlucky. They think others are the problem. But in reality, they're being haunted by their own unintegrated self. They attract manipulative partners because they've denied their own power. They keep sabotaging their goals because they fear their own ambition. It's not fate, it's the shadow playing puppeteer. Jung believed that the more we pretend to be purely good, the more dangerous our shadow becomes. Because now it must hide. It can't be acknowledged, expressed, or channeled. So it mutates into shame, projection, addiction, or cruelty. You may start judging others harshly, not because they're bad, but because they remind you of the parts you've buried. And in this moral blindness, your inner world turns against you. The solution isn't to destroy the shadow, it's to integrate it. To admit that you are not just light, but also darkness. That you have desires you've disowned, emotions you've denied, and that facing them doesn't make you evil, it makes you whole. Jung said that shadow work is not a luxury, it's a necessity. Because if you don't do it consciously, your shadow will do it for you, in ways that hurt. The most dangerous people are often the ones who think they're completely good. They project their darkness onto the world, convinced they're fighting evil, while never confronting their own. This is how wars begin. How abuse hides behind righteousness. How good intentions become weapons. Jung's message was clear: silence breeds shadow. And the longer you avoid your darkness, the more it grows in secret, waiting for a moment to break free. In today's world, appearances often matter more than substance. Social media has turned morality into performance, a game of likes, hashtags, and public declarations. People don't just try to be good. They try to appear good in the most visible way possible. This is virtue signaling, the art of displaying moral superiority without necessarily living it. But Carl Jung warned that this kind of ego inflation is spiritually dangerous. The more obsessed you are with looking righteous, the more disconnected you become from your shadow. Virtue signaling is rarely about true values, it's about identity maintenance. The ego wants to feel safe, admired, and superior, so it builds a costume of goodness. But behind the curtain, unconscious drives remain untouched. You can post quotes about compassion while secretly harboring rage. You can preach authenticity while lying to yourself daily. Jung understood that the ego loves illusion, and nothing feeds it more than a carefully curated moral image. When goodness becomes a brand, it loses all meaning. It's no longer about the soul, it's about optics. You don't wrestle with your darkness, you just hide it better. You don't seek transformation, you seek validation. This kind of public virtue often leads to private hypocrisy. Jung would say that the louder someone tries to prove their goodness, the more you should question what they're avoiding in themselves. Worse yet, virtue signaling creates a false sense of moral superiority. You begin to believe you're better than others simply because your mask is shinier. This fuels judgment, tribalism, and emotional rigidity. Instead of understanding others, you condemn them. Instead of self-reflection, you point fingers. This is the ego at war with the unconscious, refusing to look inward, clinging to the illusion of moral purity. Jung saw this dynamic as a form of spiritual bypassing. Instead of doing the hard work of shadow integration, people project their inner darkness onto others. They become addicted to goodness theater, playing the part, collecting praise, but never evolving. And the cost is profound. You lose touch with your instincts, your honesty, your fire. You become a hollow shell, perfect on the surface, tormented underneath. The only cure is radical honesty. Not with the world, with yourself. Why do you want to be seen as good? What are you afraid people will see if you drop the act? Jung's work invites us to abandon the game and do the real work. Facing the shadow, integrating the self, and building an inner life that doesn't need an audience. Because when you stop performing, you finally start becoming. One of the most seductive traps of being good is self-righteousness. It begins subtly, a quiet belief that your values are superior, that your perspective is more enlightened. But over time, this becomes a spiritual poison. Carl Jung called it moral inflation, the ego hijacking virtue to elevate itself above others. Instead of growing in awareness, you grow in arrogance. And the more convinced you are of your own goodness, the more blind you become to your flaws. Self-righteousness kills introspection. When you believe you're already right, you stop questioning yourself. You ignore your projections, your inconsistencies, your darker impulses. You preach, but you don't listen. You judge others harshly while giving yourself a moral pass. Jung warned that this type of unconscious inflation disconnects you from reality and from your own soul. At its core, self-righteousness is a defense mechanism. It shields you from guilt, uncertainty, and the discomfort of being wrong. But that comfort comes at a cost. You become emotionally rigid. Growth requires vulnerability, the ability to admit you're flawed, impulsive, human. When you cling to being the good one, you shut the door to that vulnerability. And with it, the possibility of transformation. Worse still, self-righteousness is contagious. It spreads through groupthink, especially in ideological communities where doubt is seen as weakness. People become more concerned with defending their moral identity than seeking truth. Nuance is lost. Dialogue becomes war. Jung understood this dynamic as a collective shadow, the moment when people externalize their darkness and believe they're fighting evil, when in fact they're possessed by it. This is why Jung urged for humility in the process of individuation. You are not your ideals. You are not your opinions. You are a complex mix of light and shadow, capable of both beauty and destruction. When you forget this, you fall into the most dangerous illusion of all, that you're above your own darkness. And that illusion keeps your shadow in control, silently directing your behavior while you pretend to be the hero. True maturity begins when you question your virtue, not when you flaunt it. It's not about abandoning your values. It's about grounding them in self-awareness. The path forward isn't moral superiority, it's psychological integration. You don't become stronger by denying your flaws, you become stronger by facing them. That's the essence of Jung's message. You don't conquer darkness by pretending it's not there. You conquer it by bringing it into the light. Behind many nice personalities hides a silent storm. You say yes when you want to say no. You smile when you're irritated. You sacrifice your needs to avoid conflict, and you do it so often that it becomes automatic. On the outside, you're helpful, agreeable, polite. But inside, you're simmering with unspoken frustration. Jung warned that repression always has a cost, and for the nice person, that cost is buried resentment. This resentment grows slowly. It builds each time you're overlooked, taken for granted, or disrespected. But pretend it doesn't bother you. You convince yourself you're doing the right thing, that being selfless is noble. But secretly, you're keeping score. You start expecting recognition, appreciation, even admiration. And when it doesn't come, you feel betrayed, not by others, but by a world that refuses to notice your quiet sacrifices. The truth is, niceness without boundaries breeds bitterness. You're not being kind, you're being compliant. And compliance is not a virtue when it comes at the expense of your truth. Jung saw this pattern as a shadow strategy, a way of manipulating others into liking you while avoiding your own anger. You don't express what you feel. You hint, you sulk, you martyr yourself. This is not love. It's emotional suppression in disguise. Eventually, this internal conflict becomes unbearable. You start resenting the very people you've tried to please. You resent their freedom, their confidence, their selfishness, because deep down, you wish you could be like them. But you've locked yourself in the identity of the good one, and now you feel trapped. Jung believed that if this resentment isn't brought to consciousness, it will turn toxic, poisoning your relationships, your self-worth, and your emotional health. Many good people don't realize how much they secretly hate the world. Not openly, not with rage, but with a quiet, constant bitterness. They hate being overlooked, underappreciated, used. They hate how their goodness has brought them pain, not peace. But instead of confronting this truth, they double down on being even nicer, hoping that more self-sacrifice will finally earn them love. It doesn't. It only deepens the wound. Jung's warning was clear. You cannot heal by pretending. You cannot grow by repressing. To break the cycle, you must face the resentment. Acknowledge the anger. Set the boundary. Speak the truth. Because real kindness doesn't come from self-erasure. It comes from wholeness. And wholeness begins when you stop being nice and start being honest. Jung's ultimate goal wasn't to mold you into a model of virtue. It was to help you become whole. Wholeness isn't about moral perfection. It's about embracing the fullness of who you are, both light and dark. It's about integrating your strengths and weaknesses, your virtues and vices, into a cohesive, authentic self. If you've spent your life trying to be good, you've probably overlooked the darker, wilder parts of yourself. But those parts are essential to your growth and power. True integration requires you to confront what you've repressed. It means acknowledging the rage you've hidden, the desires you've denied, the ambitions you've feared. By avoiding these aspects, you keep them in the unconscious, where they grow stronger and more destructive. Integration isn't just a mental exercise, it's a deep emotional and spiritual process. It's about making peace with the parts of you that society doesn't approve of and that you've been conditioned to hate. Once you begin to embrace your shadow, you'll notice profound changes in your life. Instead of running from your flaws, you'll learn to navigate them. You'll stop fearing your anger and start using it as a source of power. You'll stop denying your desires and start channeling them into productive outlets. This integration makes you whole because it unites your light and shadow, creating a balanced and authentic self that operates from a place of truth. Jung emphasized that the process of integration doesn't happen overnight. It's a lifelong journey of self-discovery and acceptance. You will face moments of discomfort, confusion, and pain as you confront the parts of yourself you've ignored or suppressed. But in these moments, you'll also experience profound freedom. By no longer pretending to be good or trying to please others, you'll step into a life that is uniquely yours, not a life shaped by external expectations. When you become whole, your actions are no longer driven by fear or obligation. They are driven by authenticity. You no longer need to hide behind a mask of goodness or virtue. You act with integrity because you've reconciled with your full self. This is where real power lies, not in playing the role of the good person, but in being a fully realized human being who has embraced both their strengths and weaknesses. Integration, therefore, isn't about being perfect, it's about being real. It's about accepting that your imperfections are as valuable as your virtues. Only by acknowledging and integrating your shadow can you truly step into your full potential. Because when you stop striving for an unattainable ideal of goodness, you finally allow yourself to live authentically, free from the constraints of societal expectations and the need for external validation. The strongest people aren't the ones who appear to have it all together. They're the ones who have confronted their darkness head-on. Jung believed that real strength arises from the courage to face your own shadow. It's easy to look good on the outside, to present a polished, virtuous version of yourself to the world. But true power comes from embracing your inner chaos, your imperfections, and the parts of yourself you'd rather hide. This dark side is where your deepest potential lies. Courage isn't about acting without fear. It's about facing fear, anger, and pain without running from them. To truly love, create, lead, or protect, you need access to your raw instincts, the fire that fuels your will to act. By suppressing these instincts in favor of appearing good, you disconnect from your authentic self. Your strength comes not from denying your darkness, but from integrating it into who you are. It's the tension between light and shadow that creates the real force within you. Jung suggested that those who try to be perpetually good are often operating from a place of insecurity and fear. They avoid confrontation with their darker impulses, hoping that by hiding them, they will be safe from criticism or rejection. But this only weakens them. True strength doesn't fear the darkness, it engages with it. When you suppress your darker traits in the name of virtue, you make them more dangerous. They will always find a way to leak out, usually in destructive and uncontrollable ways. By confronting your shadow, you reclaim the parts of yourself that have been hidden or rejected. This is not about becoming a villain or indulging in harmful behaviors. Instead, it's about understanding and accepting the full range of human experience, both the light and the dark. When you learn to balance both, you unlock an authentic power that no amount of false goodness can provide. This is the key to achieving true personal strength. Jung also believed that those who face their darkness could access deeper wisdom and insight. The shadow is where your deepest desires, fears, and potential lie. To create, to lead, to influence, you need to be in touch with these raw, primal aspects of yourself. The more you repress these qualities, the more disconnected you become from your true capabilities. Strength comes not from rejecting your darkness, but from transforming it into a force that drives your growth. Finally, by owning your darkness, you free yourself from the constant need for external validation. When you stop pretending to be perfect or good, you begin to operate from a place of authenticity. Your decisions, your actions, and your relationships become aligned with your true self. This is the power of integration. It's not about being perfect, it's about being real. Only by embracing your full range of humanity can you step into your true strength and live a life of purpose and fulfillment. The journey from people-pleasing to authenticity begins with the recognition that seeking constant approval is an unhealthy and unsustainable habit. People-pleasing is rooted in fear. The fear of rejection, the fear of conflict, and the fear of being unloved. While it may seem harmless, this behavior ultimately sacrifices your true self for the sake of external validation. Over time, it erodes your sense of worth and leads to frustration as you constantly bend to the will of others, neglecting your own needs and desires. True freedom comes when you stop trying to be everything for everyone. The first step in breaking free from people-pleasing is establishing clear boundaries. This means learning to say no without feeling guilty and recognizing that your time, energy, and emotions are valuable. Boundaries protect your authentic self from being swallowed up by the demands of others. Without them, you're a puppet to external forces, constantly shifting your behavior to fit the mold of what others expect. Boundaries aren't about being rigid or selfish. They are the foundation for a healthy, balanced life. Without boundaries, there is no room for authenticity to thrive. Being authentic doesn't mean being rude or inconsiderate. It's about being honest and true to your feelings, without the need to hide behind a mask. Conscious honesty is the key here. Instead of agreeing with everyone just to keep the peace, authenticity demands that you speak your truth, even when it's uncomfortable. It's not about being tactless, but about honoring your feelings and beliefs, no matter how they may differ from others. Authenticity requires you to be vulnerable, to show up as you truly are, without pretense or fear of judgment. A common misconception is that authenticity means doing whatever you want, whenever you want. But in reality, authenticity requires self-awareness and a deep understanding of your values. It's about acting in alignment with your core beliefs, rather than living in reaction to the opinions or expectations of others. The shift from people-pleasing to authenticity requires you to confront the parts of yourself you've hidden away for fear of rejection. When you stop trying to please others, you can begin to live with integrity. Your actions reflect who you are, not who you think people want you to be. One of the hardest challenges in this transformation is learning to let go of the need for constant approval. We often tie our self-worth to how others perceive us, but this is a recipe for dissatisfaction. No one can meet your needs all the time, and relying on others for validation only sets you up for disappointment. True authenticity comes from within. It's about embracing your imperfections and accepting yourself fully. Once you stop seeking external validation, you can finally start living in a way that's true to you, rather than to a carefully crafted image. Authenticity isn't a destination. It's a continuous process of growth and self-discovery. As you move away from people-pleasing and embrace your true self, you'll find that the relationships you build are more meaningful and fulfilling. You attract people who respect and appreciate you for who you are, rather than for the version you think they want to see. The more you lean into your authenticity, the more powerful and liberated you become. Authenticity isn't just about being true to others. It's about being true to yourself. and in doing so, stepping into the full potential of who you are. Carl Jung didn't want you to be perfect. He wanted you to be whole. Being good is often just a survival strategy, a mask we wear to fit in and avoid confrontation. But the truth is, growth demands more than perfection. It demands self-honesty. It demands integration, the courage to embrace both your light and your shadow. When you stop trying to be good and start becoming real, you step into your full power. Only then can you truly live with integrity, not because you're trying to look virtuous, but because you've faced the darker parts of yourself and made peace with them. The real work begins when you stop pretending to be who you think the world wants you to be. It's time to let go of the illusion of moral perfection and start embracing your true self, flaws, fears, and all. This is where the journey to true authenticity begins. So take a deep breath and ask yourself, what would happen if you stopped trying to be good and started being real? If this video resonated with you, don't forget to like, comment, and share. I want to hear your thoughts on how you face the battle between being good and being real. Have you ever felt trapped by the need for approval? Drop your experiences below. Let's get the conversation started. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe for more content that challenges the way we think about success, authenticity, and self-growth. Remember, the path to true strength begins with the courage to face your shadow.